Welcome everyone, Costin here on Serious Gaming with my review of Battlefleet Gothic Armada II. I've played and finished the campaign as the Imperial Navy on the hard difficulty. I've started the Necron campaign, in which I've spent a reasonable amount of hours also playing on hard. I also spent dozens of hours in the beta before the game came out in both multiplayer and skirmish, and also of course playing what we had available to us during that beta period of the single player, so the prologue, the first sector of the Imperial Navy campaign, the first sector of the Necron campaign. I've also played the first game quite extensively, multiplayer, skirmish, campaign, several times completed the campaign. I feel when talking about Battlefleet Gothic Armada as a series, it's worth remembering a couple of things. This is a middle market developer, when not the greatest experience in developing games. I mean, Tendalas Interactive, the company that makes these games, had only developed 2 games before they started work on Battlefleet Gothic Armada 1. And those 2 games were not big games, nor were they very well received. So the fact that we actually got Battlefleet Gothic Armada 1 in the state that it was rather surprising considering the history of this developer. They did a good job with that game, considering the resources. This is not Relic Entertainment, the AAA developer, squandering millions of dollars on something like Dawn of War 3. No, this is a middle market developer working for a middle a middle market publisher and Focus Home Interactive, and obviously Games Workshop. Limited resources, not the most experienced staff, so there were mistakes, limited budget, that kind of stuff. I feel Focus Home Interactive, as a publisher by the way, generally does a good job and has done, considering the resources they have, the resource they've put forward, has done an outstanding job for a lot of the games that they've published over the years. At the same time, I cannot help but feel extremely frustrated with Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2. There were mistakes made that come from the first game, like same issues that were present in the first game. And on top of that, there were other issues that didn't exist in the first game. So their inexperience, or really their ineptitude as a developer, is really shown here. It's not just a case of they didn't have enough money or the game was rushed or anything like that. No, they made decisions that just didn't pan out very well for this title. I feel that the focus of the game was, some people are saying, oh, it's the multiplayer and the campaign was tacked on. I mean, yeah, but you'd expect the multiplayer to be better than it was as a result of that. No, I think that their main focus for this particular title was, let's add as much as we can here. So as many factions, all the tabletop factions, copying them from tabletop to a video game, which may not work out the best, right? You can take a lot from tabletop, but there are some things that just do not translate well. And this is most certainly the case with Battlefleet Gothic Armada. Not just 2, but also 1. So it was a problem in the first game, it's a problem in the second game that they didn't address. Like, yes, they are copy and pasting stuff, but it doesn't work very well, does it? In a lot of respects. And then, the fact that they work, as many factions as we can, all the sub-factions as well, which is just basically reskins, sure, but still, you have that to consider. And then, let's have 3 individual campaigns. Now they're working on a 4th one. Is the 4th one going to be any better than the first 3? I mean, the first 3, there's few good moments, there's some really bad moments, and a lot of it is just a forgettable, boring, frustrating slog of a mess. There's no focus, no good pacing. Yeah, there's some good cinematics, sure, low budget ones as some people have mentioned, but the cinematics team did their job. I feel no one else did their job. Like, the voice acting is, in some cases, okay, in many cases, absolutely fucking terrible. And the story pace and the story script doesn't really work out. I mean, playing the Imperial Navy, I had a character getting killed, coming back from the dead at another point because I did things in a certain order. So clearly, things were not very well planned for this. Which is in contrast to how they handled things in the first game. The first game, in a sense, with how the story progressed, with how the campaign progressed. Yes, you had the variety of missions, attacks, invasions, all that. It could deal with worlds that could fall, worlds that you could reclaim, that kind of stuff. But in the first game, there was a certain path, you know, there was a certain linear path with missions, and the story quality, the quality of voice acting, I feel, was better in the first game than in this second game. So that's certainly an issue. A lot of missions, you know, just feel far less interesting. Most of the most of the campaign missions, or scenario battles, as I'd call them, because really they're more like self-contained scenarios than, you know, some real well-thought-out campaign. Most of these battles, scenario battles, are pretty boring, dull, and very badly designed. The only exception I found to the rule was the mission where you go deal with the Necrons as a faction on the campaign as the Imperial Navy. That felt like Warhammer. That felt like how Warhammer should be in the form of a video game. You know, grand in scale, epic, huge, you know, a huge space battle going on between the Imperium and the Necrons. You having your up to 3 fleets deployed in that, with the reinforcement from 2 Space Marine chapters, as well as an Adeptus Mechanicus fleet. That was suitably epic, suitably, you know, well handled for a Warhammer title. That's how a Warhammer game should feel. But for much of the rest of the game, including a lot of the main, quote-unquote, main story missions, they screwed it up pretty badly. It just, you know, it's all over the place, suffice to say. Voice acting's all over the place. Characters are ridiculous or very badly written. And contrast this to the first game. In the first game, compared to what they did in the first game, like, look, I had no knowledge of, you know, the Gothic War. I don't follow Warhammer 40k in the sense, oh, I read the novels or the rule books or anything like that. I'm not the tabletop player. All that I experience through Warhammer, most of it is what I read online on, say, wikis and in other places, and also what I experience in video games. But in the first game, playing that first game, sure, there were deviations from what is the canon, right, of the Gothic War, of the 12th Black Crusade, but for most part, they captured the essence of what had happened. There were some disappointments, but overall, facing the planet killer, facing Abaddon, dealing with this invasion that where the Imperium forces in the Gothic sector are desperate, outnumbered, constantly constantly fighting against superior forces. That's how, you know, the game captured that feeling. Like, if you read the wiki article on the Gothic War and then you play that game, you'll find it mostly in line. There are deviations, the biggest one obviously being Admiral Spire, the main character, which is, you know, who's basically standing in for half a dozen other characters that were dealing with the issues that he was dealing with in the context of the game. But overall, it's very much in line. Gothic Armada II is like a really bad case of fan fiction. Not particularly well written, messy, and just bluntly ridiculous. It's like, when I say bad fan fiction, it's like, let's shove as much shit as possible in this, regardless of whether or not it makes sense. Actually, the whole point of the campaign doesn't make sense, because this region of space, or some of it at the very least, especially Cadia, should be consumed by the warp. Just an idea. I mean, trying to take the story seriously, you can't. Difference between this game and the first game. And beyond that, presentation is the biggest issue that I have with this. Not just with this game, but the series. In the sense, the smallest of ships in this universe. Like, since this is a spaceship battle, right? Well, Warhammer as a universe is a universe about grandiose scale, over-the-top nonsense, ridiculous, over-the-top nonsense. That's how you could describe Warhammer. Everything turned up to 11th. No, 11, forget that. Oh, everything turned up to over 9,000 if you want to go with that. That's how Warhammer is. So the smallest of ships, the escort vessels, you know, those tiny little dots you're seeing in this video, because I've been showing footage from late game and early game. Those tiny little vessels, those escort classes, are bigger, larger than the biggest skyscrapers we have built on this earth right now. Think on it. Close to 1 kilometer in length. The light cruisers are taller than mountains. Some mountains. Just think on it. 1.6 kilometers, 1.5, 1.6 kilometers in length. The battleships would be about as tall as Mount Everest. Do these ships look as Mount Everest to you, as huge as that would be? You know, when you're thinking about Warhammer ships, you're thinking about these mammoths in space, using firepower on an unimaginable scale. The game, both games, do an absolutely atrocious job representing this. I mean, a craft world, think of it, a craft world, which you do see in the game. A craft world should be the size of a planet, or close to it, right, or a moon. There's the equivalent, the only reason the Necron mission does something right is you have what's the equivalent of a Necron Death Star, and that's big enough, sure. That's one of the few instances where the game doesn't screw it up. But when we have ships like the Phalanx, or the Vengeful Spirit, or the Macrag's Honor, or the Ancient One for the Tyranids, that should be the size of cities. Think on it. The size of cities, then what we end up with is a pretty huge disappointment. And it's not just how big things are, it's how battles play out. You know, there's a lack of, I guess you could say, the soul of Warhammer. This game doesn't have the soul of Warhammer, except in parts, like, say, the cinematics and the prologue. Like this moment, that's suitably Warhammer enough, or the moment in the Necron mission. But I want to give people some comparison here from a game that was released over a decade ago. That's Star Wars Empire at War. And this is not just a not subscripted battle, not some campaign battle. This is a random battle, I thought. Yes, with high-end units, but just take a look.
Watch for enemy ships.
Calculate every possible destination along Atlantis trajectory.
Regroup. I'm on this one. I'm hit. Under control. Watch him. He's coming around. We're being targeted. I got him. I've got him.
The gravity well generator has been destroyed.
Squad, move in.
Main shields deactivated. Our engines are out.
Shield's almost gone. Got me down. Cover me now. Watch for enemy ships.
They've taken out our launch bay.
Returning to your position. He's headed your direction.
The lasers have been destroyed.
Now in position. I've got it. I'll take care of this. Tightening up.
The iron cannons are offline. Our engines are gone, sir. The shields aren't holding.
Unable to shake them. Sir, getting a lock.
Our launch bay is gone.
Let's finish him. Watch your back.
That's how a space battle should look. That's how a proper space battle should look. This is not a battle involving a large amount of units. Sure, you know, we have some high-end units, but compare that battle, those few minutes I showed you there. Yes, it has a cinematic mode, but compare that, the chaos going on, the scale of things, how things feel, to the absolute garbage we actually get in Battlefleet Gothic Armada II in comparison. Again, it's not just an issue of size, if it's what's going on, right? The amount of firepower on display. And this is made worse by the limitations in how many units you have. There's some ways to get past those. You know, there was a save game editor people were using. Then they screwed that one up. Like literally, the last patch they're preventing people from touching that save game editor. Which is what, are the developers so petty that they're telling people, oh, you can't play the game your way because we want you to play the game this way. Well, your way is garbage, Tendalas. It's not something people want. I mean, just to give you an example, there's a bug at the moment in the game where if you play a skirmish battle, you can get a huge number of enemy ships. Now, obviously, I'm going to lose this battle that I'm showing here, but this is how what you should have more in line with Warhammer, with the standards present in Warhammer. Huge fleets duking it out with massive ships capable of annihilating planets. A battleship, an Imperial Navy battleship has the ordnance, potentially, of annihilating a planet or life on a planet. Let alone something like the Planet Killer. Yes, the Planet Killer, which is capable of outright destroying an entire planet. Not just wiping out life on it, but destroying the very planet. Or Blackstone Fortress. Or Free Blackstone Fortress is capable of destroying a sun, making a go supernova. That's the kind of things, you know, there's a huge disconnect for you as a player compared to what you know lore-wise these ships should be, these fleets should be, and what they are in the game. On top of that, limitations of, you know, how many ships you can bring. Oh, performance issues are not fair enough, but that's something, you know, a lot of people, if you look at forums, if you look at Reddit, if you look at, a lot of people want bigger battles. They want these grandiose battles. They want the scale of Warhammer. Basically, they don't want this soulless husk of a game that we've been given. Instead, they want, you know, a Warhammer game, which is what they haven't provided for us. And beyond that, there's also, you know, the campaign structure is a mess. The story is a mess for all campaigns. And there's the limitations in the campaign as well. Limitations, by that I mean, well, what they're really lacking in this game is also on a gameplay level. To give you an idea, in this game, the best course of action as a player is, 1, find the cheesiest tactic you can for your faction. So if it's, you know, say for instance, Terrans. What's strong about Terrans? Well, it's your boarding actions. What's strong about Tau? Your torpedoes and bombers. What's strong about Adeptus Astartes? Well, supposedly your boarding actions, but you're not going to be able to really use them because you need to get close to the enemy, so you're going to get wiped out before you do that. So Adeptus Astartes lose, or Drukhari, just the sheer amount of firepower. So it's about using cheese, but beyond that, it's also about using the biggest ships available, which is not really good design or balance for a game, is it? If the best strategy for you as a player in a lot of cases with a lot of factions is bigger is better. And this is something that does apply for a lot of the factions in the game. Not all of them, I might add. Certainly not all of them. But for most of them, it certainly is the case. I mean, take for instance the Imperial Navy. Would you rather bring 4 battleships that can withstand an enormous amount of damage and be able to smash through much of the enemy opposition, or would you try a mixed fleet? Well, you're not really going to win with that mixed fleet in a lot of cases, especially when you don't get, you know, you don't even see what race your opponent is playing before you have to select your fleet before you battle. You select your fleet, then find an opponent. I don't give long for this game to live in as a multiplayer title, though I don't think that they were particularly focused on that, you know, on making it a multiplayer title. In the campaign, same idea applies. You don't want a variety of ships in your fleet. You want the biggest ships possible, with the exception of, you know, you can, anything lower than a cruiser is a bad idea. And if you can get 4 battleships or 3 battleships in your fleet in the campaign, that's certainly a better idea than bothering with a mix of cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships. You know, having a mixed fleet. A fleet of 3 battleships is going to withstand a lot more, do a better job, and that's just bad game design. And that creates an issue. I mean, going back to the example of Star Wars Empire War, what that game did very well with the, besides giving a great sense of how space battles should be in terms of scale, cinematic effect, and all that. What that game did very well is that it made every ship, regardless of which tier you were playing, it made every ship useful. So fighters and bombers were exceptionally useful because bombers are really good against capital ships. It's the vulnerability of capital ships. Bombers will do a lot of damage to, say, Star Destroyers. And fighters will be able to soak up some damage and deal with enemy fighters, keep them in place. Well, how do you counter fighters and bombers? Well, you bring in escort vessels. Vessels being able to take down a significant amount of fighters and bombers, being able to do a lot of damage. Escort vessels, of course, being countered by bigger ships. Then, of course, you also have the ability to bring artillery platforms. Those are units available. Artillery ships being ships loaded with missiles, able to bypass defenses and do a lot of damage. So they're particularly useful. That's good design. That's good balance. It means that regardless of which point of the game you're playing, regardless of which units you're playing, your units are useful. You can take a fleet that's tier 1, shall we say, and be able to stand your ground to a good extent against a high-level fleet. Your lower-level units are not useless suddenly because your opponent has a cruiser. Your escorts aren't suddenly not useless. In Battlefleet Gothic Armada II in particular, because in 1 you obviously had limitations on battleships, battlecruiser, and that, but in 2 you don't have those limitations anymore. Well, but anyway, in Battlefleet Gothic as a series, ships, the bigger ships are just significantly more powerful, and they don't really have a weakness against smaller ships. If you bring a smaller ships against a bigger ship, you're likely to lose at the end of the day. And that isn't necessarily good design from the developers, and I think that's certainly something to work on. I'm not saying that they should try and copy Star Wars Empire War. I think that game has its own share of problems, but I think that they need to consider this subject when balancing the game, designing games and their game, and also not imposing very low limitations. I mean, people want fleets. They want fleet battles. They want their ships to be useful. They don't want a campaign where they're dealing with a ridiculous urgency meter in some vain attempt by the developer to, give the player some sense of urgency, I guess. I mean, the first game, you didn't have this ridiculous urgency meter. Another big issue. But you still felt that urgency while playing it. You felt that every battle mattered. Well, in this game, despite this urgency meter, and you can disable it because people disliked it in the beta, and it should tell you something about the developers. If they release a beta, they find out that their great ideas for a campaign or in battle modes don't work out. So, you can disable the urgency mode. Oh, the capture point battle, well, you can disable that too. So that's great design, isn't it? It should tell you something. On top of that, I feel there's an issue with the balancing in terms of difficulty, especially when, obviously when talking about a campaign. It might not seem like it, but I think that, and this is a general issue with a lot of games, not just obviously this game, but a general issue is a lot of games are not really balanced properly across multiple difficulties, and yet developers keep insisting that they put in multiple difficulty levels in their games instead of, doing what should be reasonable, just making a good, well-balanced, well-thought-out campaign, single-player experience with one difficulty level. That would certainly work far better. I mean, my favorite game on the subject is a game called Ultimate General Gettysburg, where you didn't initially, for the very longest time, you didn't have any kind of difficulty levels. All you had were AI profiles, more aggressive, more defensive, and everything in between, right? That you could deal with. And it was certainly a more interesting experience than, the enemy is doing 10% more damage to you, or has 30% more ships, or anything along those lines that a lot of developers like to go for. And I don't think that the campaign experience is really that great. It's a slog, it's frustrating, it's boring in many respects. It's also frustrating that you have multiple fleets. You have to, because there's a leadership limit per fleet, but there's also a battle leadership limit that's higher, right? and you'll be battling multiple enemy fleets. You have multiple fleets on your own, but you cannot choose which ships you initially deploy. You cannot choose which ships will reinforce you or when. That gets decided randomly. There are some ways to game it, like depending on in which order you send fleets to a system before the battle. Like, that's what I figure out. So that order is something that determines it. But even then, it's, you know, a nonsense system. Like, if you're gonna force the player, okay, you're gonna have to use reinforcement ships, at least give the player the option to decide which ships the player wants to bring in that battle. We had the option in the first game, which portion of the fleet we were going to use. We don't have that option in this game. That gets decided for us. What the hell? Did they put any effort, really, when designing this campaign compared to even their own game, their first game? So that's what I have to say on Battlefleet Gothic Armada II. It has many issues. I certainly hope that whatever campaign they're working on, it's not going to be like the first three. I would certainly hope that they would improve on the campaigns already existing. The only things that they've said so far is, oh, we're gonna give you an optional skirmish mode for bigger battles with more epic units. Okay, how about improving the single player? How about, you know, the campaign? How about fixing the many issues in regards to that? Probably not. How about not designing a campaign that's going to be utter garbage because it's going to use many of the systems the existing campaigns already are? How about that idea? But yeah, that's what I have to say on this game. Is it worth playing? You know, despite that, you know, despite all I've said, I still will continue to play this game. These are, you know, issues that the game has that should be addressed, that the developers should be aware of. You know, when making a review, or not saying, when making a review, it's, you know, it's to an extent giving criticism, or a large extent giving criticism about something because you want it to improve. You want people to do better. You don't just want, you know, developers to get content with what they've released, which is certainly what I feel a big issue with the gaming industry today when it comes, especially when it comes to reviews that get pushed out for a lot of titles. And by the way, this is also part of the reason why there's such a disconnect between, say, user scores and professional reviewers. Anyway, Costin here on Serious Gaming signing out. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for more. If you like my content, support me via PayPal, Patreon, so I can continue making it.